Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. I'll be joined later by Barry Malone. Coming up tonight, we take a look at the failed coup in Benin over the weekend. Paramount is getting involved in the potential Netflix-Warner Brothers deal, or I suppose it's trying to scupper that deal and get its own one through. And we'll talk about Zack Polanski's Question Time controversy over care work and immigration. As ever, if you'd like to support our work, you can sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Make sure to let us know your comments in the YouTube comments. As the US deepens its pivot away from Europe, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has arrived in London to hold talks with three of the continent's most powerful leaders. Zelenskyy met with German Chancellor Friedrich Merz and French President Emmanuel Macron alongside British Prime Minister Keir Starmer at Downing Street today for private talks. The topic was the US president's peace plan for Ukraine, one that would see the country cede large parts of its territory to Russia. There have, of course, been tense negotiations over the plan, with European leaders negotiating on behalf of Ukraine to try to minimize the country's losses while not rewarding Putin for invading a sovereign state. Trump, however, is in a hurry to end the war, having promised he'd do it nearly a year ago on his first day in office. Last night in Washington, the commander-in-chief seemed at the end of his tether.
What's your next step in Russia-Ukraine talks after last week's negotiations?
So we've been speaking to President Putin, and we've been speaking to Ukrainian leaders, including Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy. And I have to say that I'm a little bit disappointed that President Zelenskyy hasn't yet read the proposal. That was as of a few hours ago. His people love it, but he hasn't. Russia's fine with it. Russia, I guess, would rather have the whole country when you think of it. But Russia is, I believe, fine with it. But I'm not sure that Zelenskyy is fine with it. His people love it. But he hasn't read it. So someday you'll explain that one to me, Jeff.
I find that somewhat implausible. Maybe Trump knows something we don't, but the idea that Zelenskyy hasn't read it, the peace deals that have been published publicly aren't very long. So it sounds to me like that is probably a half-truth. You'd be very frustrated hearing that, of course, if you were Zelenskyy. His people love it, but he just won't read it. My understanding, is there's a lot of ambivalence in the Ukrainian population, but the idea of giving up territory which is still currently controlled by Ukraine and which the Ukrainians have fought over for years, I don't think that's the kind of thing which the Ukrainian people love. Whether or not they'll be willing to accept it, that's a difficult question I probably can't answer, but I feel pretty confident saying they won't completely love it. Those comments followed high-level talks between the US and first Russia, then Ukraine. Last Tuesday, Putin met with Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner and his envoy Steve Witkoff at the Kremlin for 5 hours of talks, later described as constructive but in need of work by one of Putin's advisors. That was followed by a third round of talks between Kushner, Witkoff and Ukrainian officials in Florida. Those meetings resulted in this statement from both sides. Both parties agreed that real progress towards any agreement depends on Russia's readiness to show serious commitment to long-term peace, including steps towards de-escalation and cessation. That doesn't sound especially optimistic. For its part, Ukraine, backed by Europe, has repeatedly claimed that the talks are a stalling tactic by Russia to allow it to carry on seizing territory in Ukraine. Russia, on the other hand, has struck out at European leaders, accusing them of stymieing any chance of peace in the region by constantly putting forward unreasonable demands. And Trump appears very eager to ease the deadlock. Before his meeting with Zelenskyy today, Starmer was asked if he'd help the US president out.
What pressure will you be putting on him to accept the peace plan?
Well, I won't be putting pressure on President Zelenskyy. I will be talking to him about the peace plan. The most important thing is to ensure that if there is a cessation of hostilities, a ceasefire, and I hope there is, it has to be just and it has to be lasting, which is what we will be focused on this afternoon. So I've got President Zelenskyy in for a session which will include quite a bit of private time to talk to him about the peace plan and to make sure that it is something which can ensure that if there is peace, it is a lasting peace. Because we have had a ceasefire before and it's not being kept. And so it's very important that we get this right.
Barry, what do you make of this? Whenever Ukraine comes up, I'm very clear, illegal invasion. Whenever it comes to how does it end, it gets much more difficult, doesn't it? I'm not sure if we've spoken about this at length before, so I want to know your perspective on this.
No, I don't think we have. I think that the Ukraine-Russia war and Trump's attempts to bring it to an end are probably the greatest failure and embarrassment of his presidency so far. And I think he kind of knows that, because I think you said in the introduction there, it was one of the first things that he promised to do. One of the first things that he said he was going to do was broker peace in Ukraine. And that he was going to, sort of leverage his relationship with Putin to do that. I think, though, that in the last year, what we've seen is Trump completely outmaneuvered by Putin to an extent that it's made Trump look a little bit weak almost. And I think, we know that Trump likes to position himself as this swaggering New Yorker, this deal maker who can handle all the tough guy leaders. And Putin has come out looking like the tough guy, and Trump has come out looking a little bit weak so far. It's really trite for me to say that about, political leaders. One's come out looking like the tough guy. But that's how Trump views these things, I think. And what we've seen in the last year is a kind of a flip-flopping where, there have been times when he's blamed Zelenskyy. There are times when he's blamed Putin. But it feels like he's now settled into publicly backing Russia and taking Russia's position and putting pressure on Zelenskyy and European leaders to accept this deal, which, as we've known all along, would involve Ukraine giving up some territory. So I think we're at an impasse that we've been at for a really, really long time. And the impasse does not end, as things currently stand, without Ukraine ceding territory. But I think that the European position on this is really, really important also. Starmer said today that he wouldn't be pushing Zelenskyy to accept anything that Zelenskyy didn't want to accept, or that the Ukrainian people didn't want to accept, which is, an admirable position. But, you do also wonder about, how the Europeans will look at the possibility of a deal that gives away Ukrainian territory to Russia, because ultimately they will see that, or many of them will see that, as rewarding Russia for an illegal invasion of a sovereign country on European territory, and see that as a dangerous precedent to set. And I think in their eyes, all the more dangerous, given what we appear to be seeing is the US orienting itself away from those European countries right now.
Let's look at that broader reorientation, because the Europeans have had another shock from Washington in recent days. So late last week, the Trump administration released the country's new national security strategy, which has sent a chill across Europe's political capitals. I have to say, look, it's written in a very informal style. It seems like like a memo someone's just put together. But a central part of the strategy's criticism of Europe is aimed squarely at the bloc's support for Ukraine. The document says this: the Trump administration finds itself at odds with European officials who hold unrealistic expectations for the war, perched in unstable minority governments, many of which trample on basic principles of democracy to suppress opposition. A large European majority wants peace, yet that desire is not translated into policy, in large measure because of those governments' subversion of democratic processes. So the idea there is that basically there's no support for Ukraine across Europe, and the only way that Germany and the UK and whoever are able to sort of conjure up support for Ukraine is by suppressing the opposition, which I have to say is not true. I mean, repeated prime ministers who've been unpopular have decided the one thing they can do to try and make themselves look a bit better is go and meet Zelenskyy. Boris Johnson did it. Keir Starmer's doing it. That's not the sign that support for Ukraine is unpopular, right? That's the sign where you say, well, it's very difficult to unite the British public, but they do seem to like Zelenskyy and they don't seem to like Russia's illegal invasion. So this seems like, I suppose, a fabrication from the White House. The unrealistic expectations, that potentially has a little bit more honesty to it. Presumably that's a reference to Europeans refusing to sort of agree to Russia having any Ukrainian territory in exchange for a ceasefire. So potentially a critique of the Europeans could be that they're being unrealistic. The idea that they're suppressing opposition to supporting Ukraine, I find a lot less credible. The document also takes aim at what it calls, quote, Europe's civilizational erasure. That's really the real theme of this strategy, I think. So they say this: the larger issues facing Europe include activities of the European Union and other transnational bodies that undermine political liberty and sovereignty, migration policies that are transforming the continent and creating strife, censorship of free speech and suppression of political opposition, cratering birth rates, and loss of national identities and self-confidence. Should present trends continue, the continent will be unrecognisable in 20 years or less. As such, it is far from obvious whether certain European countries will have economies and militaries strong enough to remain reliable. So it's that sort of a obsession with demography and population and migration. And the theme continues when it comes to NATO. So they say, over the long term, it is more than plausible that within a few decades at the latest, certain NATO members will become majority non-European. As such, it is an open question whether they will view their place in the world or their alliance with the United States in the same way as those who signed the NATO Charter. So he's basically saying Europe might not be white enough to be a reliable ally. I mean, it's the only way you can interpret that. Few current European leaders have responded directly to the document, but former ones have been able to say what they really think. So this was former French ambassador to the United States, Gerard Araud, if I've pronounced that correctly, or correctly enough. He said, the United States has just published a national strategy review that I recommend reading. The stunning section devoted to Europe reads like a far-right pamphlet. It largely confirms this perception. Sweden's former Prime Minister Carl Bildt said this. In saying that Europe faces civilizational erasure, the Trump new security strategy places itself to the right of the extreme right in Europe. It's language that one otherwise only finds coming out of some bizarre minds of the Kremlin. And that reference to the Kremlin was not entirely unreasonable, I think, because one person on the continent who seems happy with the document is Vladimir Putin. So the Kremlin has described the strategy as aligning with Russia's vision and has called it a positive step. Barry, what does this mean? I mean, because, we can talk about how bad and racist Donald Trump is, which undoubtedly he is. The more interesting question is probably, how do the Europeans deal with this? Because what do you do in that situation? Do you just have to say we're divorcing from the Americans because they don't seem particularly interested in any kind of defensive alliance? They just seem interested in the racial makeup of our countries and continent. Of course, this isn't going to be a long-term security strategy for the United States if the Democrats win the next general election. So sort of, do you radically shift your policy based on this? I mean, it's also very interesting that this comes, 2 or 3 years ago, everyone was talking about how NATO is stronger than ever. It had new members, how sort of what Vladimir Putin had done is re-established the primacy of the transatlantic alliance between European countries and the United States. And now you've got this document from the White House, which basically says Europe's not white enough to be a strong ally. Is it time for a divorce?
First of all, it's a really bizarre document. It's incredibly strange. It's utterly absurd. Has any country ever published a national security strategy replete with white nationalism? It's insane. Who wrote this? Tommy Robinson? I mean, when I read it, I could not wrap my head around it. It was so bizarre. And I conclude exactly what you conclude, that the US is saying that it can only ally itself with white countries. I mean, that is the current position. But you're right, it puts European leaders in an incredibly difficult position. I know what you're saying, that when a new US government comes in, if it's the Democrats, they're unlikely to continue with a policy like this. But we don't know if a Republican of Trump's ilk might come in the next time. And and also I think we have to bear in mind, and this is kind of crazy to realize, Donald Trump's only been in power for a year, not even a year. And he's proven that in that time he can do all sorts of damage and he can make all sorts of significant changes that would take a long time to undo. We have another 3 years of Donald Trump. We're going to have another 3 years of this government post the publication of this strategy. And I think that European leaders have to take that really, really seriously. And I think we need to accept that Europe and the US are fundamentally out of step now on Ukraine. Fundamentally. And yes, there were differences on Ukraine strategy when Joe Biden was in power, when the Joe Biden administration was there. But I think that everybody sort of broadly agreed that Russia was a threat. And if you look at the language in this strategy, it doesn't seem like the Trump administration sees Russia as a threat anymore, or certainly doesn't want to position Russia as a threat anymore. So it's really difficult because the European leaders know that the US is the most important NATO member. It is, I think Trump is correct, and Hegseth is correct to make the accusation that European countries to some extent rely on US protection. So what are they going to do? Are they going to continue to do this sort of softly thing that they do with Trump, where they try to appease him and they say, okay, we will ramp up our military spending, so we are not as reliant on the US? Or do they just sort of fundamentally accept that relationship has ruptured and they need to do something else to ensure European security, which, unfortunately, really the only solution for that is to ramp up military spending. So I don't know how European leaders are going to react. We need to see, but they are in an incredibly difficult position after the publication of this bizarre document.
Yeah, I mean, the sort of strategic analysis I sort of keep reading from people I respect, basically, is to say that Europe needs to respond with further integration of some form or other. Because, you can say, well, this means that they need to increase military spending so they can have a more autonomous role in the world, which probably is true, let's face it. But at the moment, my understanding is that the military is sort of more expensive than it needs to be and less powerful than it needs to be because it's so distributed among different countries or with their different procurement practices and doesn't operate as one. So a country like Russia with a much smaller GDP, way less military spending, is able to outmaneuver Europe because we don't have any sort of coherent strategy or plan. Whether or not you can sort of force a coherent strategy and plan on a continent of all different people who speak different languages, who all have their own complex internal politics, is another question. I don't feel particularly optimistic about that, especially if you look at the political makeup of European parliaments at the moment. I mean, that's the point that Donald Trump makes, where he has recognised a real, or whoever wrote that document, someone's saying it's probably Stephen Miller with Grok, which is not entirely implausible, where he says he finds it hard to believe that you've got all these governments playing hardball when they're these minority governments who can barely, get a majority together in their own parliaments and they want to dictate the terms of the United States military strategy in Europe. Some truth to that, right? Europe isn't very good at showing that it can be a united force on the international scene. Trump has recognized that weakness, and he's exploiting it to the max. It's never a good sign when a group of soldiers suddenly assembles in a TV studio. But that's exactly what happened on Sunday in the small West African state of Benin, where a group of soldiers stormed the state broadcaster to tell a shocked nation that they'd mounted a coup. Announcing the insurrection, Benin Army officer Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigri said his soldiers were acting to, quote, give our country a new direction following the many failures of the President Patrice Talon. The coup didn't last long, though. Within hours, explosions were heard in the administrative capital, Cotonou, after neighbouring Nigeria appeared to have sent free fighter jets to help quash the uprising. By the evening, the country's president appeared on a live broadcast, commending the work of the military who'd remained loyal to the government and promising that those behind the coup would not go unpunished. At least a dozen soldiers were arrested during the day, but other organisers, including Tigray, remain at large. Some have taken hostages, thought to include a number of senior military leaders. The coup was roundly condemned by African and international leaders, which isn't surprising given that Benin has enjoyed uninterrupted democratic rule for the last 2 decades, with the current President Talon having been elected in 2016 and then again in 2021, so a relatively stable country. He has faced accusations of suppressing opposition to his policies. What makes this story especially interesting, though, is that this is just the latest in a string of attempted or successful insurrections across Africa's Sahel region in recent years. And the Sahel is the dry transition zone between the southern Sahara Desert and more humid areas nearer to the equator. And the region has had so many successful or attempted coups that the region has now been described as the coup belt, from Sudan in the east, which has now faced free insurrection since 2020 and of course is now currently in the middle of a really, really horrible, bloody civil war, to Guinea in the west. There have been at least 14 attempts to overthrow governments along that belt in the last 5 years. Further south, Gabon and Madagascar have also seen their governments toppled. Benin now, of course, joins the list too, although this was a failed insurrection. That latest attempted insurrection also wasn't the only one in the region this month. So just 2 weeks ago, there appeared to be a coup in Guinea-Bissau, also in West Africa, after the military seized power from President Umaro Sissoko Embalo. Now, I say appeared to be a coup because, interestingly, regional power brokers Nigeria and Senegal have both sort of suggested that the coup wasn't a real coup, and that the president had, in fact, set it up to avoid having election results coming out the following day. So they thought the manner in which he was flown off to Senegal with all of his luggage and his family seemed all a little bit too convenient for a coup. So it maybe seemed like that's the way he wanted to end his career. Presumably some deal with the military, which meant that whoever had won the election doesn't enter power, and I think they've got an interim president at the moment. As I say, that deposed president is currently in Senegal. Barry, I thought this was a good opportunity to cover this story because on your Proximities newsletter, you have a very recent explainer on why there are so many coups in West Africa. So what is the explanation? Why are there so many coups in this region?
Yeah, I've been following the individual coups, but also the phenomenon of coups in West Africa quite closely in Proximities. But I have to say that this one did surprise me when the news broke. It surprised me in one way, but then it sort of didn't surprise me in another way. And the reason I found it surprising is because Benin has been a very stable country. You know, it's been, in effect, a democracy for 2 decades now. You know, yes, under President Talon, there has been some suppression of criticism and of opposition, but it never looked like Talon was trying to sort of cling on to power or anything like that. There's, you know, in contrast to some of the other countries where we've seen coups, there is an election coming up, I believe, in April next year. Talon is not standing. I think the candidate who he endorses is going to be the finance minister, who, yes, was fancied to win that election. Yes, there's poverty, but, you know, there always has been. So there didn't seem to be any massive spark. But then what is interesting, and I think what is partly behind this, is the conflict that we've talked about before on the show in the Sahel. And we've had military coups in Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso, which are the 3 countries at the center of that conflict. You know, we have an area called the tri-border area where all those countries' borders meet. And there are armed groups there, Islamist armed groups who are managing to fight all 3 governments at once from that area. Primarily, the sort of the most powerful group and an increasingly powerful group is a group called JNIM. And recently, that conflict has come across the border into Benin. Benin sort of sits just below Burkina Faso and Niger, so you know it's also vulnerable to the groups who operate in that border region. I was speaking to someone today who knows this story very well and has very strong sources in Benin, who told me that there has been discontent in the army for quite a long time, and that some of that discontent is about the government's response to the armed groups increasingly operating across the border in Benin. Some of the military officers think that it's costly, there's too much money being spent on it, that the government is fighting it in a very inefficient way, that they're not seeing results, and that they're leaving the country more vulnerable to these groups. And, you know, they could end up, Benin could end up being as destabilized as the other 3 countries in the region who are fighting those groups. The other thing this person told me is that there's discontent in the armed forces about promotions and salaries, and there are sort of cliques within the army who are competing for promotions, for salaries, for influence. So there was an element of kind of disgruntlement, some people are saying, behind this coup attempt also. The officer who led it Pascal Tigray, yes, he's a senior sort of operational officer, but he, according to the people I spoke to today, was not considered somebody who would have had the heft to lead a coup. And so to me, that points to a sort of a widespread discontent. And so now what I think we need to look at in the Benin case is how Talon responds. I think that some people think he's going to respond quite harshly. If he does respond harshly, is that going to quell discontent in the military? I think what we have to look at is that military-civil relationship now and how it plays out post this attempt. And if Benin does prove vulnerable to a coup, and if there is a successful coup, then it's going to add itself to a slate of countries in West Africa. I mean, a list that's getting so long, I might struggle to remember it. But, I think we start with Mali in 2020, then we have Guinea, then we have Burkina Faso, we have Niger, we have Gabon, we have the weird incident in Guinea-Bissau, which may or may not be a coup, and now we have an attempt in Benin. What we could be ending up with is an entire region under the control of military juntas, which I think I said in Proximities a couple of weeks ago, has kind of come as a surprise to a lot of African political analysts who kind of thought that, a lot of these countries that had been coup-prone in the past had actually gone through long periods of stability. So yes, in terms of why there's a pattern, a lot of it is to do with insecurity. A lot of it is to do with this war in the Sahel. There are also, I think the military recognizes in these countries that if they launch a successful coup, there are now regional structures that they can get involved in, and they will get support from other military juntas. So Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have now formed their own regional organization, having been expelled from ECOWAS, which is like effectively West Africa's kind of European Union. They've set up their own group called the Confederation of Sahel States. They're launching a joint biometric password. They have a passport. They have a regional court. They have a regional bank. And so, I'm sure that these military officers who attempted this coup in Benin probably thought that if they were successful, that they would join up with these other countries. And so there's a welcome ready for you in West Africa if you manage to launch a successful military coup. And I think that's partly behind the sort of the contagion and inspiration that we see happening.
John Pullen in the comments says, interesting what's going in Burkina Faso with Ibrahim Touré. No, don't hear much about it in the West. And so as far as I don't know too much about this, but Ibrahim Touré comes to power, I think, in 2022 in a coup, but he's overthrowing a military leader anyway, so it's not like overthrowing a democratic government. And he sort of uses sort of Pan-African anti-imperial rhetoric and is very popular, I think. I mean, clearly I don't know that much about this situation. Can you, I imagine you know a lot more than me. What can you tell us about Burkina Faso and Ibrahim Traoré?
He's a great example to raise in the comments because, I think one of the things that I said in the Proximities deep dive that I did on the coups is that some of the coups have been tremendously popular. People were, especially in that tri-border area, were absolutely fed up with the insecurity. And then I think what's interesting about Traoré in Burkina Faso is, and by the way, he is hugely popular in Burkina Faso, but he's also hugely popular on the African continent. I think there's an argument to be made that he's the most popular leader on the African continent right now. I can't think of anybody else who's more popular than Traoré. And part of that popularity is that he set himself up as an anti-imperialist. Like one of the first things that he did after coming to power in 2020 was to kick out French troops who were based in the country, to speak out against the sort of neo-imperialist behavior of France in West Africa and reorient his foreign policy towards Russia. And that's very, very popular, not only in Burkina Faso, but in other countries in West Africa, because France has been a malign player in the region as the former colonial power. And it has engaged in massive exploitation of the countries that it used to rule, and I think that's widely recognised by the public. And so to have somebody like Traoré stand up against the West is really, really, I think exciting for a lot of the people in Burkina Faso. And the other thing that he's done is, he's quickly introduced policies that he says are aimed at lifting people out of poverty. So he set up a state-owned mining company. Foreign firms who invest in the country now, whether that's in mining or in other industries, are expected to give a 15% stake in their operations. They're also being asked to train the Burkinabes and sort of upskill them as a condition of being in the country. He's nationalised some gold mines. And then the other thing is the economy is actually doing pretty well under him. And one thing that I found absolutely remarkable is that recently both the IMF and the World Bank both sort of complimented the success of the Burkina Faso economy. I mean, can you imagine that? We have this sort of anti-Western, anti-imperialist military leader who is allied with the Russians, and the IMF and the World Bank, can't but admit that the economy is actually doing well under him. So yeah, it's a super, super interesting case. You should probably get somebody on from there to talk about it in the future, because it's an incredible story. But it's not just in Burkina Faso. Yes, in some of the other countries, the coups are popular. Look, people want stability. And so, yeah, it's not as simple as a story that we would often see reported in the Western media, which is that, the military have taken control, they've toppled a democratic leader, because in many of those cases they weren't toppling democratically elected leaders. It's a much more complex and interesting picture than it's often painted. So I completely agree with your commenter there.
Let's go on to our next story. I've got an extra cushion. Someone in the comments says, does Michael look a bit low today? And someone else said it's when Aaron came in, he threw a strop and stole his pillow, which is actually kind of true. He didn't throw a strop and steal the pillow, but he needed it for his one. So now I've got two cushions. I should be a little bit higher. The future of one of Hollywood's oldest movie studios is currently the subject of a multi-billion-dollar bun fight, which could shape the future of entertainment and potentially politics. On Friday, Warner Bros. Discovery announced it had agreed a sale to streaming giant Netflix, who would pay shareholders $83 billion for the acquisition. However, earlier today, Paramount Pictures has now offered $108 billion in a hostile bid, appealing directly to shareholders, so bypassing the current managers of Warner Bros. Warner Brothers is, of course, most famous as a century-old Hollywood production company. They created the Looney Tunes franchise, and more recently, Harry Potter and Superman. Warner Bros. Discovery also owns TV giant HBO, which produces prestige shows such as The Sopranos and White Lotus, and the news network CNN. Now, either of these purchases, so not entirely confirmed which one will happen, be it Netflix or Paramount, either of them could be worrying for different reasons. One for the future of entertainment, and the other for the future of politics. Bit of a rock and a hard place situation here. We'll start with the Netflix deal, which was announced last Thursday. This is the deal that, due to market concentration, people think would be a disaster for the film and TV industry. In the New York Times on Saturday, Roy Price, who is the chief executive of an entertainment studio and was previously the head of Amazon Studios, said the deal could be the end of Hollywood. He pointed out that Netflix spends $18 billion a year on commissioning, and Warner Brothers spend $20 billion. Now, combined, that would make up 20% of all spending on the film and TV industry, which includes sports rights. So it will be a much bigger proportion of actual films and actual TV. And that would mean that much of the investment that goes into TV and film is concentrated in one place. And that would mean that diversity and cultural output would take a big hit, because instead of having two different funders you can play off each other, you just go into one person, one company. So this producer wrote this. Having fewer bidders generally means that fewer shows get made. Fewer visions means a narrower range of storytelling. Consolidation aligns decision-making around one organisation or one individual's point of view. If the merger proceeds, the feature film development ecosystem already imperiled will be further constrained, leading to fewer and less interesting movies. And will this new entity nurture the kind of risky sensibility that brought us premium television like The Sopranos and The White Lotus? So in America, all these shows are on HBO Max. Here, they're on Now TV or Sky Atlantic, depending on which one you have, if you have either. What the merger would mean for films on theatrical release, so i.e. those which are in the cinema, could be even worse than for sort of interesting series. Before Netflix's deal to buy Warner was announced, James Cameron, who you'll know as the director of Terminator, Alien, Avatar, Titanic, all sorts of other Oscar-winning films, said this to the Town podcast about what Netflix buying Warner would mean.
Oh, Netflix would be a disaster.
You
Sorry, Ted, but geez, Sarandos has gone on record saying theatrical films are dead.
Outmoded, yeah.
No, theatrical is dead, quote unquote. Theatrical is dead.
I don't know if he said that, but he said that it's an outmoded experience.
It's a quote.
For most.
It's a quote, at least to the extent that you can verify anything.
But now he's promising theaters if they buy Warner Brothers.
I know, but it's
he doesn't believe that.
It's sucker bait.
Yes.
Right? It's sucker bait. And we'll put the movie out for a week. We'll put it out for 10 days. We'll qualify for Academy Awards consideration. See, I think that's fundamentally rotten at the core.
So that's James Cameron talking about Ted Sarandos, the CEO of Netflix. I'm going to show you a quote from Sarandos that I'd seen circulated this weekend. It's from 2024 in an interview with the New York Times. So he said, Barbie and Oppenheimer would be great for Netflix. They definitely would have enjoyed just as big an audience on Netflix. And so I don't think there's any reason to believe that certain kinds of movies do or don't work. There's no reason to believe that the movie itself is better in any size of screen for all people. My son's an editor. He is 28 years old and he watched Lawrence of Arabia on his phone. Now, Lawrence of Arabia, sort of a real classic movie of the 20th century, also has these beautiful sort of expansive panoramic scenes of the desert, sort of camels sort of going over sand dunes and stuff. The idea of spending, I think it's also about 3 hours long. Like, I don't know how someone is watching a 3-hour film on their phone. Strikes me as depressing. I'm not sure I want this guy in charge of cultural output in the United States, but there we are. The Writers Guild of America, also unhappy with this particular bid. So they're obviously one of the main unions in Hollywood. This was their statement when it came to the Netflix offer. So they said, the world's largest streaming company swallowing one of its biggest competitors is what antitrust laws were designed to prevent. The outcome would eliminate jobs, push down wages, worsen conditions for all entertainment workers, raise prices for consumers, and reduce the volume and diversity of content for all viewers. Industry workers, along with the public, are already impacted by only a few powerful companies maintaining tight control over what consumers can watch on television, on streaming, and in theatres. This merger must be blocked. So that was the Netflix bid. Doesn't sound good to me. Sounds like a bad idea. I hope it doesn't happen. Let's now look at Paramount's hostile takeover bid. Now, this counts as a hostile takeover bid because it doesn't have the approval of the current managers of Warner Brothers. Instead, they've gone straight to the shareholders. So how this works is that the managers of Warner Brothers invited people to make various bids. They agreed with the Netflix bid. So the CEO of Warner wants to sell to Netflix, but now Paramount is saying, we're going to go directly to the shareholders and say, look, you shareholders, you need to outvote the current CEO and let us buy the company because then you'll make more money. That's what's going on here. Of course, as you'll know, Paramount is another streamer and film production company. It made movies like Mission Impossible, Top Gun. It owns CBS, which is a news platform. I think it might also show other things, I'm not sure. Also Nickelodeon, MTV, Comedy Central, lots of content that I'm sure you'll have watched. Again, just like with Netflix, this would concentrate the market for cultural production, though not to quite such an extreme degree. In fact, the bigger deal with Paramount is politics. So Paramount was bought earlier this year by David Ellison, the son of Larry Ellison. You can see David there on the right, Larry on the left. And that picture's from about 20 years ago. There don't seem to be many recent pictures of them together for some reason, although they are very close. Larry Ellison is the owner of tech firm Oracle. He was briefly the world's richest man earlier this year, and that was after a deal between Oracle and OpenAI. He is a key ally of Donald Trump. He's sort of hosted fundraisers for the president. He's also a very, very keen Zionist. In 2017, he donated $17 million to the IDF, or Israeli Occupation Force, which is more accurately described as. And he said this to Israeli TV in 2014.
The renewal of the Jewish state is something that I think touches all of us. For 2,000 years, we were a stateless people. And now we have a country of our own, defended by all the brave men and women of the IDF. So anything we can do to support them, who devote their lives for preserving the state of Israel, keeping the people safe, and allowing our state to continue sometimes in very, very difficult situations.
Now, in case you're wondering whether Ellison is one of those liberal Zionists we're often told about, he's an ally of the current leadership of the country. In 2021, Netanyahu holidayed on Ellison's own private island. The Ellisons have also had no gripes about using their media acquisitions for political ends. When they bought Paramount, the news channel CBS, as I've said, was included in the deal. And David Ellison, so that's the son who's been put in charge of it, his first move at the channel was to employ pro-Israel, anti-woke commentator Bari Weiss as its editor-in-chief. Buying Warner would mean they could bring that same approach to CNN, presumably. And from his interview with Bloomberg today, sort of after announcing this counter-offer, or this hostile takeover bid, David Ellison made it clear that newsmaking is a big part of his motivation.
CNN, I assume you would combine the news gathering operation with CBS's if, in fact, you did own that asset?
Yeah, so look, we've been really clear since probably the last time we were here what we want to do with news,
yes,
which is we want to build a scaled news service that is basically fundamentally in the trust business, that is in the truth business, and that speaks to the 70% of Americans that are in the middle. And we believe that by doing so, that is, for us, kind of doing well while doing good. And we believe in that business model, and we believe it's essential.
And do you think the president embraces the idea of you being the owner of CNN, given his criticism, obviously, for that network in the past?
By the way, we've had great conversations with the president about this, but I think but I don't want to speak for him in any way, shape, or form.
Now, you've had great conversations with the president. Do you really think that he's convinced that you're going to make this into a trust business and a truth business? Not that I think that is their motivation. Anyway, the relationship of the Ellisons to Donald Trump had long been seen as something that could help lubricate any potential purchase of Warner by Paramount. Larry Ellison is a personal friend of Donald Trump. He's, as I say, he's hosted fundraisers for his election campaigns. And the Paramount counteroffer for Warner Brothers puts these comments from Donald Trump last night about the Netflix takeover bid in a slightly different light.
Should they be allowed to buy Warner Brothers? Should Netflix?
Well, that's the question. They have a very big market share. And when they have Warner Brothers, that share goes up a lot. So I don't know. That's going to be for some economists to tell. And also, and I'll be involved in that decision too. They have a very big market share.
So there was a brief moment where people thought maybe Donald Trump is a principled antitrust guy. He really doesn't want monopolies, so he wants to keep this big company and this big company from merging. Or maybe he just knew that the Ellisons were going to put in a hostile bid later in the day and he's better friends with them. We've also learned, if you think this already looks a bit cozy, we've also learned today that the Trump family is deeply involved in the bid from the Ellisons and from Paramount. So Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, an unofficial Middle East envoy, also envoy to the Russians, it seems, is, in fact, one of the financial backers of Paramount's Warner Brothers bid. Also, lots of sovereign wealth funds from the Arab states. I think the Saudis, potentially the Qataris, Jared Kushner and Larry Ellison all want to buy together. They've all clubbed together to buy Warner Brothers and CNN. Barry, neither of these look great. So you've got a merger with Netflix, which I think would be incredibly damaging to sort of plurality in the entertainment industry, or a merger with Paramount, which again would be sort of damaging for plurality when it comes to what kind of dramas get made, for example. Not necessarily as disastrous as Netflix, but with this much sharper political concern. which of these would you take? Are you sacrificing entertainment or politics?
I would take neither of them. It's this whole thing is so depressing. I saw somebody saying on Twitter recently, "Oh, it's awesome to live in a world that's controlled by like 5 guys." I just honestly think that that's where we're going. You know, to talk about cultural output for a moment without coming off like a complete snob. You know, this is the enshittification of culture. You know, if Netflix end up buying Warner Brothers, yes, I think James Cameron is right. They don't want us going to the theaters. They put things in the theaters to qualify for awards. And I've never heard anything more absurd than watching Lawrence of Arabia on your phone. I mean, not to come off all Christopher Nolan about this, but Jesus, do not watch Lawrence of Arabia on your phone. You know, we all know that when we go to Netflix, we get served up a homepage and people are, you know, too lazy to dig down and find anything worthwhile. Quite a lot of the time on that homepage is slop. And they are incentivized to make lowest common denominator stuff. Martin Scorsese was slammed a few years ago for saying that Marvel films weren't cinema, that they were theme park experiences. I'm not saying that we shouldn't make Marvel movies, but I think he's right. And so you look back to like the 70s and you think if Netflix owned Warner Brothers and we keep consolidating, you know, would the Conversation be made? Would Badlands be made? Would Chinatown be made? You know, probably not. So look, it's crappy for culture. But the most important thing is the political aspect, the possibility that Paramount will buy it. Antitrust laws in the US, as far as I understand, can be quite difficult to enforce, can be quite patchy, and can be quite politicized. Also, I heard somebody who was a former head of the Federal Trade Commission say today that a president being involved in a decision like this would be completely unprecedented. This is not an executive function. This is supposed to be a technical analysis to figure out whether or not this is a monopoly too far. And I think it's blatantly obvious that Trump sounded a note of caution about Netflix because he favors the Paramount bid. I think the Ellisons are incredibly dangerous operators when it comes to the US media landscape, when it comes to the US news landscape. And I have never seen a news network or a media entity destroyed as quickly as CBS News has been destroyed since Barry Weiss was made the editor-in-chief. And look, CBS News is an incredibly storied, incredibly well-respected US news source. And within 2 weeks of Barry Weiss taking over that network at the behest of the Ellisons, I went to their website and all I read was pure pro-Israel propaganda and increasingly pro-Trump propaganda. I never thought it was possible to dismantle a news network that fast. So, yes, I do not want culture destroyed, but the Ellisons are very, very dangerous people. And Trump getting involved in this is just massive executive overreach, notwithstanding the fact that his own family is involved. This is insane levels of corruption.
You've said neither. I mean, it should really be neither. It shouldn't be the case that either of these get approved because this is market concentration, whichever one buys the other, or whichever one sort of gets to buy Warner Brothers, let's say. It's market concentration, which will increase the monopoly power of either Paramount or Warner, or Netflix, depending on who gets it. And Matt Stoller, who is a sort of very vocal anti-monopoly campaigner and writer, very popular Substacker, said neither Paramount nor Netflix can legally buy Warner. Warner's slate of movies this year is doing well. It's the #1 studio at the box office. It can easily remain independent. It's a profitable, great business. He's saying, you know, according to American law, this shouldn't be legal. Of course, obviously, politics might get in the way of that. Interesting as well, he's saying it should remain independent. And when sort of I've been speaking to people in the studio today about this story, say, well, why does Warner even want to sell? And what's interesting here is Warner didn't want to sell. There was no decision made by Warner to say this business isn't going very well, or, you know, we want to do something else, we need to sell it, because it's got these distributed group of shareholders who can't really make decisions like that. The only reason we're discussing Warner being sold is because Paramount put in a bid earlier in the year, because the Ellisons are on this sort of buying spree when it comes to media. They put in a bid which had to be considered by the management of the company because it was their fiduciary duty to try and get the shareholders as much money as possible. So there was nothing wrong with this company. This company could have just sort of continued making films, managing CNN, whatever. Maybe you don't love CNN, but you know what I mean? This wasn't a company in distress, but it was just that you had these giant companies who said, actually, we want to buy you. And because it's the legal responsibility of the company to maximize shareholder value, they have no choice but to sort of agree to a takeover bid. And as I said, the management of Warner, so the current CEO and the board, they approved this sale to Netflix, but now the Ellisons and Paramount are saying, you should have actually accepted our bid. Now we're going to go public and tell the shareholders what they could have had, and they're going to try and get the shareholders to outvote the current board of directors. But it is crazy that this can just happen to a business which was just happily plodding along doing its business. It wasn't the case that someone has to buy Warner. It could just continue as an independent business, and we'd have less market concentration, more choice, less Trump allies owning news companies. It seems like one of those situations where the status quo is actually better than all the changes being suggested. So why will it be allowed to go ahead? Well, for much of the 20th century, this is exactly the kind of attempted acquisition which would have been blocked by the competition authorities. America used to have a very sort of proactive anti-monopoly enforcement agency, I suppose, in the state, but that's been weakened since the 1980s, as was explained brilliantly by the writer Cory Doctorow, writer of the book Enshittification, a term which Barry mentioned earlier. And it just so happens that Cory Doctorow spoke recently to Aaron Bastani in a brilliant interview we put out yesterday. And I'm just going to show you a short clip where he explains how anti-monopoly law has been eroded in America to the detriment of all of us.
The reason we don't have market competition anymore is not because of the great forces of history. It's not because of the iron laws of economics. It's because neoliberal economists from the Chicago School said that monopolies were efficient and demanded that governments stop enforcing anti-monopoly law. And they said if you encounter a monopoly in the wild, if Google has a 90% search market share, that must be because they made the best search engine. And wouldn't it be perverse to use public resources to shut down a company that has been so great that we all have chosen to use their products? And so 40 years ago, they demanded a halt to the enforcement of competition law. And over 40 years, there's been a continuous drawdown of it. And now we have monopolies in every sector. It's not just tech, although the internet is 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. But it's also sterile bags full of saline. It's semiconductors, it's intermodal and sea freight, it's professional wrestling, it's cheerleading, it's glass bottles and vitamin C. Wherever you look, there's 5 or fewer companies that are running it. And again, it's not a mystery where this came from. And the only way that you can make it a mystery is if you have the specific kind of brain injury that you can only get by doing an economics degree. And so you have these economists who said we should stop enforcing monopoly law, and who would then see these monopolies all around us, and who are like, well, how do you know it's our fault? Right? And it's like we used to not have a rat problem. We were putting down rat poison, and then these guys convinced us not to put down rat poison, and now rats are eating our faces off. And when we complain about it, they say, well, why are you looking at us? Maybe this is just the time of the rat.
Very, very entertaining guy. I recommend listening to that entire interview. I suppose sort of super summarized what changed when it came to monopoly enforcement is it used to be the case that the competition authorities would judge market concentration to be bad in and of itself because it gives these companies too much power, it undermines choice, et cetera, et cetera. They'll have too much market power to raise prices. What changed after the 1980s was that Chicago economists, so sort of people in the Milton Friedman school, said actually concentration has lots of benefits. So sort of going from 10 competitors to 3, it means you'll get economies of scale. And unless you can prove that they'll raise prices, you should let it go ahead. So that's why, Meta or Facebook was allowed to buy Instagram and WhatsApp to become Meta, because they said, well, the price of WhatsApp isn't going to increase. The price of Instagram isn't going to increase. So what's the harm? What it does mean is that now Mark Zuckerberg has so much power over the advertising industry that he can do real damage to media companies, for example. You can't make money now if you're an online newspaper, unless you're the New York Times, because all the ad revenue goes to Meta or it goes to Alphabet. So, big problem, and we seem to be continuing along that line. Actually, Joe Biden did have some sort of significant people who were very anti-monopoly in his administration, Lena Khan at the FTC. But I think Donald Trump is much more, let's say, a bit less principled with it. So he'll be against market concentration unless you're his friend, in which case he thinks is absolutely brilliant. Labour have been ramping up their attacks against the insurgent Greens, led by Zack Polanski, and Keir Starmer has sort of put the boot in, giving this quote to The Observer over the weekend. So he said, "They're anti-NATO at a time when the world is more volatile than it has ever been. The Green Party thinks it's all right to sell drugs and there should be no restrictions. So somebody could sell drugs outside my children's school. But if you're a landlord, it should be unlawful. That's nuts. They're dangerous." Now, I mean, this is just so patently dishonest. The idea that anyone who's... I think there are strong arguments actually against legalizing all drugs, because I think I can see why, for people who are already taking drugs, harm reduction is good. People will always take drugs, and there are huge costs to it being illegal. But I do think it's, if you legalize them, people will take them more. And with some of the harder drugs, you kind of really don't want that. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to have different positions on whether drugs should be decriminalized. But the idea that the kind of policies Zack Polanski would introduce means that there'll be people legally selling drugs outside someone's children's school is just fanciful. It's just made up, and Keir Starmer knows it's made up. At the same time, you can see why someone's told him choose these, because these are the unpopular Green policies. The majority of the country wants to remain in NATO. The majority of the country definitely doesn't want to decriminalize all drugs. So those are the policies he's going for, but he's making the attacks in a very dishonest way. A slightly more effective attack line against Zack Polanski concerns something he said on Question Time last week.
Most people in this audience and watching this at home will have had an experience of a care worker. 1 in 5 care workers are foreign nationals. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to wipe someone's bum. And I'm very grateful for the people who do this work, this really important work, whether it's in the care sector, whether it's in the NHS.
So that was one of the many ways on that show. The whole show was about immigration. That was one way Zack Polanski tried to defend immigration to the UK. He's been widely accused of being disrespectful in that answer to both immigrants and care workers, which are two often overlapping groups. Labour MP for Stratford and Bow, Uma Kumaran, said this: "An insulting and demeaning worldview. Black and brown immigrants aren't here to do the jobs that people like Zack Polanski think are beneath them. There is dignity and value in care work. That's why Labour has introduced a historic fair pay agreement for social care workers." Wes Streeting also got involved. So he said, social care isn't just wiping someone's bum. It is a hard, rewarding, skilled professional job. That's why we're delivering the first ever pay agreement in social care and building a care profession. This is immigration as exploitation. Now, I have to say, actually, I feel for Zack here, because I have said something similar on this show before. I can't remember exactly when, but what I do remember is getting an email from someone who was a care worker pointing out that I had said something along the line of wiping someone's bum, and they thought that that was very offensive. So I wrote back saying, "Oh my God, yeah, I'm really sorry. I said that. That's a silly way to articulate myself." So I can see how it happens. But clearly that was a bad answer from Zack Polanski. Barry, what do you make of Labour's attacks on the Greens, and I suppose specifically the person of Zack Polanski?
Yeah, well, I think Zack Polanski himself has said it a lot, and many other people have said it. He has everybody rattled, and that's why everybody is attacking him. I was struck on Question Time, which I think was his second appearance on Question Time, how people seemed to have come with prepped attack lines. They were ready to try to take him down on the show. The interview that Keir Starmer gave in The Observer, though, was completely disingenuous. Like you've just said, he knows that the Greens don't want to allow people to sell drugs outside outside school gates. It's completely absurd, and that it just makes me come back to this problem I always have with the way British politics is covered, and increasingly with the way British politicians are conducting themselves. There's actually a really interesting policy debate to be had there if anybody wants to have it. You say that you disagree with the legalization of all drugs. I'm actually an advocate for the legalization of all drugs. Me and you could have a constructive debate about that. Wouldn't it be great if Labour and the Greens could have a constructive debate about that? But instead, Keir Starmer goes out in The Observer and tells a lie, and I just feel like it's the sort of look, politicians have always lied, but it's getting to the point now where we're looking at the magnification of British politics. With the carer thing, I think Zack Polanski really misspoke there, and I think it was incredibly clumsy. Look, it's reductive to say that care work is about wiping people's asses. It's also problematic to make the argument that immigration is a net good to the country because immigrants will do the jobs that you don't want to do. That is not why we should advocate for immigration being a net positive to the UK. However, we know that Zack Polanski cares about social workers and care workers. We know that because people surfaced clips of him speaking passionately about them years ago, before anybody knew who he was. His boyfriend works in palliative care. He's spoken about that too. So that's what we know. We know where he really stands, despite the fact that he made a clumsy statement. And so to see Labour politicians coming out en masse with this attack line, it was galling because it was so hypocritical. And you imagine that some kind of a WhatsApp message went down and said, okay, go out and hammer him on this. And I just think it's absurd for politicians who, have not introduced any policies to make the life of particularly immigrant care workers who are routinely exploited in this country better. And then to go after Zack Polanski for a clumsy choice of words. So, they're being disingenuous. Starmer was disingenuous. The attacks on Twitter about the care worker comment were disingenuous. And all it tells me is that people continue to be rattled by Zack Polanski.
I mean, in terms of they haven't done anything for care workers, they are, in their employment rights bill, they are introducing a fair pay agreement, which they're putting £500 million towards. And I think it's going to be the first sector with collective bargaining. Obviously, the devil will be in the detail. It will sort of remain to be seen what comes of that. But yeah, I suppose they would say that is one of the places where they have taken some action. But yeah, we should talk about that in detail at another point. Barry, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thanks, Michael.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.